am Cornelia Dolian. I am a memoir writing coach, and I have with me today Ona Gritz, who is an amazing poet and essayist and has just recently released this beautiful memoir called Everywhere I Look. I was fortunate enough to be in a just amazing writing group with Ona for a couple of years. Ona was a librarian at the Hoboken Library.
Thank you so much, Cornelia. So Everywhere I Look is an exploration of my sister's life. And she's a sister that I lost to violence a little over 40 years ago. And also a sister that I, in some way, had been losing most of my life. She was my runaway older sister. She started leaving home when I was 6, and then she started being sent away. So she was in and out of my life for the first 19 years of my life. And when she was about 20, she went to San Francisco, and for a while things were pretty rough for her there. But then she met a really great guy, and they kind of settled down and were really good influences on each other, and was starting a family when they were killed by friends that they had trusted and brought into their home, both she and her husband and their baby, and she was pregnant at the time. It's in part a true crime memoir in that I do explore the details of the case and learn what I can, but it's in there as one more thing that happened to my sister rather than the focal point of the story. Really, it's an investigation into who we were as a family, why the family was so different for each of us, how our parents treated us, what secrets were they keeping from us, and what my role was in her life.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really loved how much this memoir was. Yes, there's the true crime element, and I was sitting there kind of seething along with you. And then there is the family secrets and the family history, which is such a powerful aspect of memoir, even when it's not the focus of memoir. When you did this research on your sister's life and ultimately, her violent and untimely death, right when things were starting to go well in her life, when did you decide that search needed to be encapsulated in a memoir?
It's actually the other way around, in that I had this compulsion to write about Angie, and that came from years of really not thinking about her very much. I was very kind of not in touch with my own grief. I had a lot of shame about being the favored child in that family and having witnessed a lot of abuse and neglect and never having processed it. And a series of, really small things just had me thinking about my sister about 12 years ago, just after my half-brother died, and I was literally the only person left in our immediate family. And it just occurred to me, nobody else remembers her. Nobody knows just the little details that I remember from our shared childhood. So I began with that. And it was very limited what I remembered, because so much of our time had been split. We were apart. But that got me curious. Well, what don't I know? And, I should have realized I was already a librarian, so therefore a researcher, that I was completely capable of finding things out. But it was like a revelation that, I could actually find some things out. And then once I began that process of uncovering, I couldn't stop. It was, became a compulsion. It was like, if it had anything to do with my sister, if she was present, if she experienced it, no matter how painful it was, I wanted to know. And it also became a way to be with her again.
As I was reading it, and I was reading this book around the same time that I was reading Memorial Drive by Natasha Trethewey.
Love Memorial Drive.
I know. And, I see, a lot of similarities, like both you and Trethewey were 19 when she lost her mother and you lost your sister Angie. And she also kind of put it away for a while.
Right.
and kind of didn't feel the grief and had some of that same shame and guilt that she expresses in this sort of, could I have changed anything?
Yeah, and she also doesn't keep it from the reader who did it.
Right.
We both made the choice early on. And, I've never heard her speak about Memorial Drive, so I don't know what her thinking was in doing that.
Right.
But for me, part of that was to take the attention away from it. Like, okay, here's who did it and what happened.
Right.
Now let's explore what matters, which is who this person that they did it to.
What you both did with that is, instead of creating the mystery around what a true crime story may normally be, or what we may be used to, you actually open the door to the much more interesting mysteries, right? Which are those family secrets and that family history. And that feels like the most propulsive part. So how long would you say that you worked on this memoir in its first draft, just to kind of get it out there?
10 years. It wasn't actually the research that took so long. It was a combination of needing to step away from it because it was difficult material. And so I would step away from it and work on other projects simultaneously. But it was mostly that I didn't know how to write a book like that. And I had to do it wrong several times before I got it right.
Do you want to share with us some of the getting it wrong?
Sure. I understood the parameters of memoir because I was a big memoir reader. So I knew, this is an autobiography. So not, doesn't start on the day I was born and encapsulate an entire life. But to me, there was not enough of Angie in my life. So everything I knew and everything I remembered and everything I found out, I thought did belong in this book. So it's the early drafts were twice as long as the completed book. That was a big part, learning what belonged, what didn't, which was also learning what story am I telling and how do you tell a story. I think fiction writers have an advantage over poets when it comes to writing memoir because they understand story structure in a way that I keep having to learn and relearn. And so that was a big piece of it. And then how to structure it. Because it's a very complicated and layered story, and it was a very complicated family. So, what order do you tell things in? I always liked the braid where chapter 1 is actually right at the time of the murders. And it's a timeline that follows the immediate aftermath and my young life afterwards. And the other timeline that touches it is my childhood. And I liked how those pieces spoke to each other, but there was this 30-year gap in the middle of the one timeline. Even though I understand that when you're braiding hair, there's 3 strands or more. Somehow I thought I couldn't think beyond 2 strands. So one of my strands had this 30-year gap. And because the strands themselves were chronological, the investigative aspect, which really is the heart of the book, not the murder investigation, but the personal investigation into what happened when I approach it as an adult, came really late in the story. And I didn't know how to solve it until I took a workshop on structure with a really brilliant memoirist, Lily Danziger. She was the one to say to me, well, first of all, that's the heart of your story. It's got to come in way sooner. And I still couldn't see it because I was unveiling family secrets. And I thought, well, the reader needs to know certain things. They have to know what we didn't know before we solve those things, before we find those things out. And she said, you can bring that third thread in at any point. And that was such a revelation to me. First, that it was a third thread. and then that, okay, actually, by page 50, you know everything you need to know in order for that thread to start to make sense. So once I knew I could bring that in earlier, that really unlocked the structure for me. But the other thing I hadn't realized I'd done, and this is so startling to me, having read as much memoir as I do and as I did. In fact, I only read memoir for those 10 years. That's mostly true. Actually, I mean, I read some fiction. I read some young adult fiction, but mostly reading, very intensely reading memoir. I didn't have an emotional aspect fully developed. I kind of would say what happened and then leave it there because it was, to me, like what I felt about it was self-evident. And I'm also used to this idea that also comes from poetry that, restraint is a good thing. Trust the reader to make the meaning, put the image, put the memory, the moment out there. And in memoir, I discovered late in the process, it's the opposite. You have to lay everything bare. I mean, I knew that I needed to show my culpability, that it's important tenet in any kind of creative nonfiction that you're not harder on anyone than you are on yourself. Moment by moment, as things happened, I needed to feel them on the page. I needed to talk about who I was emotionally at that time. And that was very hard for me to access until I made the realization that this book was going to work better and be more intimate and more meaningful as a book, but also to me if I addressed it to Angie and spoke to her and let all those feelings come out as I'm confessing them in a sense to my sister. So that was a late discovery as well.
It's such an intimate choice that you made to address it to her, because in a way it's kind of all of the things maybe that you never got to say.
Yes.
And it's you seeing her. I'm wondering what healing or other effect exploring that may have held for you.
It was very healing in a lot of ways. And I would say it was more healing than painful because not feeling things is worse than feeling things. So even though I have been sadder since I wrote the book or since I began this process of writing the book, I've also felt closer to my sister. I've also felt that the relief and clarity that comes from knowing truths and speaking truths. And I developed a new compassion for her. There was just a way in which I felt two things, conflicting things at once growing up, which was that I adored my sister. I thought the world of her. And I believed the family mythology that, she was the bad girl. I was the good girl. We had our roles and, parents do define the world for us. So once I kind of could recognize that a part of me had that judgmental view of her, I let go of it right away and started having real compassion for her. And I also sort of developed the ability to see her from an adult's perspective, which I'd never been able to do before. I sort of was locked in this childhood view. It was the same stuck place that prevented me from understanding that I could, in fact, find out information. And through the process of probably saying the hardest things about myself, it may sound contradictory, but I think that that's what led to self-compassion. Because once you say the worst thing, it loses its power.
One of the things that I've been really tightly holding on to lately is that poetry is so good for memoirists because it teaches you that ability to home in on an image and stay with it and really describe it and get to just the essence of an image or a feeling. It's such evocative writing and such economical writing at the same time. And I definitely see so much of that here. But you've mentioned that was a little bit of a hindrance to you because you had to have a different mindset too, which is that fiction structure, which people get confused about with memoir. We say a lot like memoir should read like a novel. And people are like, well, what do you mean? And it's like, well, it should be structured like a novel, but be true. And it's so experience-based, right? And it's so feelings-based. And it sounds like you had some of that in there, but then the feelings part you had added in later and access that through writing to her in this book.
Yes. I have a few things I want to respond to. One is that what you were saying about staying with an image. I think another thing poetry teaches us is to bring those images back. That they can weave through a poem or through a narrative. and sort of build on themselves. I think what it comes down to, if I was to say what I felt ill-equipped to do based on my training as a poet, was to tell a story. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really what people mean when they say memoir should read like a novel, that you have to always remember you are telling a single story. And the harshest criticism I got on my early drafts is, there's so many stories here, I don't know which one you're telling.
How many drafts do you think that you went through?
I actually couldn't say, because I have this great flaw of polishing as I go. So a lot of those drafts are all in one document, So
Gotcha.
let's just assume 1,000.
Okay. Give or take 1,000 drafts. Yeah. Revision as we write is something that so few of us can actually do. It's a thing that I think a lot of the time we, especially newer writers, try to stay away from doing that. It's like, don't revise as you go. Just go. Just write.
I think that's the better approach. I mean, I think I'm a cautionary tale, because part of why this book took so long to write is that nearly half of it on the cutting room floor is really polished, and, really labored over. It's, basically years of my life are on the cutting room floor.
So how did you make those choices, right? Because I imagine everything felt important.
Everything did feel important. And it was after I got that very harsh criticism of, there's too many stories here. After just being upset for a few days, dusted myself off and thought, what can I do here? And I don't remember why I thought to do this, but I started reading articles about theme. And I don't even remember, unfortunately, who had written this one particular article that said that she would have saved herself a lot of trouble and a lot of drafts if she had known the theme of her story when she began. And so what I came upon was the word erasure. That erasure was our theme, in the sense that Angie was erased by her violent death. She was erased in our family by my parents sending her away. She was erased from my memory in my own trauma reactions. So I just literally sat down and cut out anything that had nothing to do with erasure, which left me, it just gave me a focus. Is this relevant? Is this relevant? And thankfully, I did do a lot of revising in one document, but I saved the bigger document and did this cut. And there were some things that I pulled back in as I worked and figured it out from there. But that was the litmus test that I used as I began the big cut.
Do you think you could have known your theme at the beginning, before you started on the journey?
I don't think so, because the writing of the big mess that eventually becomes the book is really where I learned not only what happened to her, but who I was in shutting all that out and in not understanding it and not even allowing myself to be curious. So with the curiosity and then the research that followed, I discovered sort of what had happened to us, so I could find the language for it and then find the common thread.
One of the things that we often hear about is the importance of interiority, which is very different from looking back with new eyes and making it seem like, looking back now, at no point in here does it feel like you're telling the story and then moralizing it. It's always, you are in it. It feels like you are always centering and anchoring internally. So no matter how deep I was getting into the mysteries of the story, or how quickly I was turning the page to find out, what happens next, what's the secret here, what does she find out in this phone call with this cousin, I never lost sight of you or what it was to you and how it was impacting you. And I never kind of stopped, not worrying, but kind of being like, oh gosh, I hope she's okay. So I think you did just a fabulous job of showing that, yes, this is a story about Angie, but this is your story too. And it's also a story about your healing. Because at the end of the day, the only story that we can truly ever tell is our own.
That was that emotional piece. at a distance until I turned it into an epistolary work. And, I didn't know how to tell the world what it was like to be me, but I knew how to tell Angie what it was like to be me.
What's been one surprising effect or impact of completing this memoir and having it out in the world?
Every time I hear from a reader that they're reading it, that it moves them, that they feel that they know and care about Angie through it. Every time I hear that, it's a surprise and a balm. That's exactly what I set out to do. Yeah. And I think it's surprising how complicated my feelings are now that it's out. It's something that I longed for and worked towards for so long. And yet, I think there was this sort of magical thinking that somehow completing the book means, she'd be less gone.
One of the things about memoir that is very impactful on readers is that it is very close to the writer in terms of this is such a personal story. This is such a lived experience that you're getting to kind of peek in on. But at the same time, it has much broader implications and reverberations. Here, it's family abuse or neglect and the way that we perceive sometimes even victims of crimes and the way that we care more about or give more of our attention to victims of crimes when they are good, law-abiding, never had a traffic ticket, kind of the perfect person. That's just so wrong and short-sighted. And you do grapple a lot with that kind of victim blaming mentality.
Yeah. It happened within the family, when my mother's response was, well, we were told by a social worker that the way she lived her life, she wasn't going to live a long life. Then to read the trial transcripts and to see the defense attorney essentially turn it and try to blame Angie for what happened. And then to learn that that's a really common tactic. You know? And also in terms of the story that's bigger than my particular family was the discovery of how children, but particularly girls, were so easily dismissed and so easily thrown away. My sister is one of so many kids that wound up in this juvenile justice system in New York City that there are similar places I discovered all over the country at that time where kids were incarcerated for non-crimes.
Right.
For running away, for being incorrigible, whatever that means, for being wayward. The law on the books that allowed kids to be put away for these kinds of actions is called the Wayward Minor Act. So, a parent had that ability at that time, this would be the late 60s, early 70s, to just say to the authorities, I wash my hands of this kid. They're, send them away. And so there's victim blaming there. These are bad kids, when in fact, they're kids in impossible situations doing the best they can.
Well, and I loved the point you make somewhere that every runaway was a throwaway first. Yes. It's in here. And that was just so powerful because when you're in a loving and accepting and nurturing place, and I mean that in an emotional place as well, right? Because you grew up in the same home, and for you, that place, that home was all of those things: loving, nurturing, caring, protective. And it really struck me too that Angie was part of that. She was part of that nurturing and that loving for you, but nobody but you was really seemingly part of that for her, and you created that respite for her as well. I think at the same time that you were straddling this line of the favored daughter being shaped by your parents' vision of the world, you were also her steadiness and her rock.
Yeah, I think that was probably true for a time, but then it wasn't enough to hold her. And it shouldn't have been enough to hold her because she shouldn't have been there. She shouldn't have been in that.
And it shouldn't have been on you to bear all of that. You talked about how you chose this format and this structure of the braided narrative going back in time. How was that to write? Were you writing the one time frame and then writing the other separately, or were you writing it kind of jumping back and forth as you were going?
I did it chapter by chapter. not necessarily chronologically. I think I wrote the childhood pieces, if I'm remembering correctly, I wrote them fairly chronologically. But the investigative pieces, I would write rough drafts of my discoveries as soon as, at some point I just had to figure out the logic of it. I mean, even just a simple thing like the investigation of their finding the bodies and their figuring out who did it. And then we're in court, with the perpetrators. Like, just sort of knowing to separate out those strands, because I was finding things out in mishmash order. Sometimes I was writing it in mishmash order.
I have to highlight the amazing presence of libraries and how much they factor in. They're a little bit of a minor character.
I love that. I love that. I never thought of it that way. I was just sort of telling it as I experienced it. But the very first thing I did was call a librarian when it came, like, how do I uncover this story? I knew the name of one town where what I thought of as boarding school existed. And I thought, I'm just going to call the town library and find out what I can find out. And that was the little brick in the bottom of the pile that made everything break open.
Yeah.
I love that idea of the library as character. Thank you.
Do you want to, if you want to, talk a little about your process for getting this book out into the world once it was ready for prime time?
So sort of the road to publication, as it were.
Right.
I started out by working with a friend of mine who is an agent, but neither of us recognized right away that the unwieldy version wasn't ready. I think she had her doubts about it, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what was wrong. But she saw enough in it and did this, maybe the pitfalls of writing a beautiful mess, from polishing as much as I did. So it went out too soon. And so it wasn't getting accepted. And I'm very grateful, ultimately, that that's not the book that's in the world.
Yeah.
And not long after I figured out what this book was, what I wanted it to be, I went to the AWP conference. In the catalog, there were several panels on university presses, and I only attended one, but I also remember sort of taking this in just from the description in the catalog, that university presses have a very different matrix for what they choose, and that it's not so market-based. It's not commercial. It's not a commercial concern because they're not a commercial endeavor. They're actually non-for-profits.
Right.
So they're not looking at how many copies is this likely to sell, and is it the in topic? How many copies did her last book sell, and how many copies will her next book likely sell? When I would get into those kinds of conversations with my friend who was an agent, I would just get so depressed because I didn't want to make creative decisions based on what the market was looking for. So when I learned more about university presses, really just choosing the books they thought were the best books that they want to get behind, it's like I could breathe more deeply. There was this other place to go that maybe shared my values more.
Yeah.
I wound up doing a round of submissions just to university presses, and Apprentice House, who ultimately published it, is a really, really unique one because, as far as I know, it's the only one. It's definitely the first who their staff are undergraduates. They're in a class. They're learning the ins and outs of the publishing world in order to decide if that's something that they want to pursue. So the acquisitions editor is a student, and what they call it, but essentially the person who gives you the critique and the suggestions is an undergraduate. The designer is an undergraduate. The promotions person is an undergraduate. So they're all learning under the helm of a really wonderful professor. But I really liked that. I liked that they were learning. So I was helping them. They were helping me.
Yeah.
Especially loved my design editor. I thought she made such a beautiful physical book. I don't think the physical object that is the book would be any more beautiful or powerful if it had been a Big Five publisher who had chosen it.
It is a really beautiful book, and it has this kind of ombre vibe to it, which I always love. We see a lot of covers that look homemade in a DIY way. People always say, well, I want people to get the closeness of it. And I think yours is something that gets at that closeness without looking DIY, because obviously, it's not. Also, the title, I know that it comes from that song, Angie, right? From the Rolling Stones. And a very similar line is also in the Full House theme song, Everywhere You Look, Milkman and the Paperboy. And so for me, before I read it, I was like, oh, okay, because it takes place in San Francisco, because it's about a family that is complex in a non-sitcom way. I thought, okay, this is going to be like a play on that. This is not your sitcom family. And so that's what I thought was so cool. What's the marketing or the getting it in people's hands work you've taken on for the book?
This is a book that, to me, I just made a decision this book can have what it wants, because it's a stand-in for my sister who did not get what she needed in the family. So it's the first time that I made the choice and took on the expense to hire a publicist. So as a result of that, I've got to do a lot of conversations, a lot of podcasts and interviews that I probably wouldn't have been able to do. And I also worked with a literary consultant who helped me get the book up on NetGalley and do a Goodreads giveaway and all these things that just kind of help readers find the book. So I did those things, and I've submitted it for some reviews and some awards that will remain to be seen.
Hey, this is Cornelia jumping in during editing to let y'all know that since recording this interview, Everywhere I Look has actually won 2 independent author awards in the categories of new nonfiction and true crime, and is also a finalist for a Reader's Choice Award.
I had a lot of events, most of them local, some of them not. I'm going to be reading in San Francisco next month, which I'm so excited for because it's such an important part of this story. And my brother-in-law's brother is going to attend, and the prosecutor who put the murderers behind bars, he's read the book, he's going to attend. And then the other thing I've done a lot of is writing related essays and some crime pieces.
When the writing got heavy, what were some of the things that you did when it got to be too much emotionally or mentally?
I didn't do a lot of good self-care in a certain way. My husband would say to me, it's midnight. You probably should stop reading autopsy reports and come to bed, because the investigator in me was so hungry, and the sister in me was so hungry to know everything. But I was lucky. I wasn't living alone when I did this. Yeah. I was raising my son. I was getting to know my now husband and then living with him and friends. And just, I had community and other responsibilities to ground me.
It seems like you had a really full life to cushion you throughout all this and to kind of hold you up while you were doing this really difficult work. To me, that is part of self-care, focusing on the things that bring you respite. I'm a big proponent of going for a walk or meditating or doing something to bring down your nervous system and calm it and all that, and taking breaks when you need them. But I think it's important too to recognize that not pouring yourself entirely into the work of the memoir and having other life things happening and tending to those other life things is so important, and probably also gives you a lot of insight into writing. You're not in this tunnel, this vacuum of just the memoir.
You remember that there's a world outside of the one that's, preoccupying your head. My husband's twin brother had ALS. And when I first moved here to live with Dan, he needed a lot of care and attention. And so we would take turns spending time with him. And, it was a very painful thing because he was losing his abilities one by one and pretty quickly. But it was also a really amazing experience because he's very kind, very wise, wonderful sense of humor. So, and in some ways, he was our guide through that period. Right. But I remember saying to him that I felt guilty that I had set my memoir aside, that so much time went by since I'd had the time and attention to give to it. And some of it was that I was spending time with him, but really it was I had moved. I had, my son was starting college, all kinds of life. Right. But he said to me, well, what have you been doing in the meantime? It sounds to me like you've been living your life.
Another topic too that I noticed that you touched on, and that's again, unfortunately, still very relevant today, is the white supremacy and the racism and how that played a part.
Yeah, well, the perpetrators themselves tried to use it, like, oh, couldn't be us,
right?
Folks.
Right, and they tried to point the finger at, the black guy. And I really actually loved the interactions between you and Greg.
I wish I could have found him.
You did such an amazing job of giving life to all these people, even if they were only on a few pages. It's an incredible study. This is how you write a memoir featuring a lot of people, but keep it tight and make it not feel like one of those ensemble movies where the cast is 36 people and you never get to know any of them very well. It feels very fluid, but also very grounded.
Thank you. That was another thing that made it hard to learn how to write, figuring out with so many people how to space to give everyone.
Yeah. And so what did you do too with the memories when they were fuzzy? Because that's a lot of what comes up, right, with memoir is, well, how do you know? I guess, how did you find your truth, or what was the process?
I don't have a good memory. At some point, I actually considered being hypnotized, and I thought, oh, well, I'll get all these memories back. Mm-hmm. But what I came to understand as I wrote was that the lack of memory was because I was dissociating.
Right.
Playing pretend was a very big part of my life with Angie, my early life with her. She's the one who introduced me to Let's Pretend. Mm-hmm. But that stayed with me, and it became my escape from the painful aspects of our growing up. And at some point I thought hypnotism wouldn't do a thing because I wasn't present. So allowing that to become part of the story really helped me. In early drafts, I might do more kind of, I don't remember the exact details of a shopping trip with my parents, but here's what it felt like. And I would write an approximation. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that stuff fell away once I started really writing it to her and getting at that interiority that you spoke of. Just like you said, libraries are a character in the story. I think lack of memory is mm-hmm. one of the themes of the story, and the things that affect memory, how grief affects memory, how trauma affects memory. My friend Kay, who is in the book, wrote me a very detailed letter of what she remembered, what Angie was wearing that day, and various things like that I incorporated into the first chapter. You made this a little bit of a community effort. You didn't just rely on your own memory. That researcher, that detective, investigator in you extended to not just getting the facts that were public record or looking into her past in those schools or those detention centers. I really, like anyone who remembered Angie and could tell me something about her, I was just hungry for that. Yeah. A lot of the artifacts that you excavated were those conversations that you had with other people. Are there any books, maybe specific memoirs or craft books about memoir that you would say helped you with this work? There's a book called Bereft by Jane Bernstein, which is has a lot of similarities to my story in that she lost her sister to murder. Mm-hmm. She was very shut down about it. Beautiful book. I read it very early on in my, I think I'm going to write a book about Angie phase. And it really sort of opened it up to what the book could be because I loved that book so much. In terms of craft books, I love Still Writing by Dani Shapiro. It's kind of partly a memoir, even as it's a craft book. So I find it very good company. And I think she's such a beautiful memoirist. And her most recent memoir, Inheritance, because it's such a detective story, was also a really good model. I'm listening right now to Maureen Murdoch's Myth Making, which is about memoir writing, but also useful to people who aren't writing a memoir, I guess. And she talks a lot about inheritance in that book. She does. Yeah. And it sounds amazing. It's definitely on my TBR. I had been a fan of her memoirs from the beginning, and it's so interesting because she wrote 3 or 4 memoirs not knowing this huge thing about herself that she uncovers in inheritance. So what is your hope for
the future of this book.
I really hope that it continues to find readers and that it continues to touch people. I just hope that it has a positive effect in what it looks at, what it talks about in terms of families and how we treat each other and the kind of love and attention that all kids need to thrive.
Yeah.
I hope all that does some good.
Well, this has been so lovely. I thank you so much for your time and your generosity in talking to me about this book and how candid you've been. I really, really appreciate it. And I appreciate you.
Likewise. Thank you for reading it so thoughtfully and deeply and showing it to me in a new way.
Well, I'm glad that I could. Thank you.